Good morning, Beth. Thank you so much for taking out the time to consult with me about my ethical dilemma of Jade. I've already sent you the case study and I hope you've read it. And let's get right into it. In order to guide me through the ethical dilemma that I'm going through right now, I used Kucher and Keith Spiegel's adapted model because it's very systematic, it's thorough, and it will very importantly allow me to understand how I've arrived at the right decision. This is probably important in the future if someone finds my decision questionable and objectionable. And so the first question we have to ask ourselves is this an ethical dilemma? So let's rule out everything else, like legal matters. Since Drew's services have been terminated, I'm not breaking any laws by providing Jade his former partner therapy. And so this is not a legal matter, and it's not a mixed dilemma. But it is an ethical dilemma because now that I'm aware that Drew was my former client, do I disclose this information to Jade? If I say yes to this question, then I would be respecting her right to informed consent. I'd be respecting her right to autonomy. But if I say, but that might actually be in conflict with the APS Code of Ethics of Professional Responsibility and confidentiality. I'd be breaking Drew's confidentiality. And so, yes, it is an ethical dilemma. So let's move on. Now, the main APS Code of Ethics of the key principles and standards that it relates with is Principle A, respect and propriety. Now, underneath these principles, there's informed consent, clarifying the foreseeable risks of therapy, and honest communication. A 3.4, which is confidentiality, that it is a psychologist's responsibility to protect a client's confidentiality, whether terminated or not. And B.3, which is professional responsibility, taking reasonable steps to prevent harm to any client. What I've realized as I went through this code was that it has a couple of limitations. It lacks clarity, and this confidentiality subsection does not cover special circumstances like Jade and Drew's. And so, in order to make a more informed decision, I turn to the overarching principles that the APS Code of Ethics is actually based on, one of which is non maleficence, which is do no harm. So that would mean do no harm to any client or anybody else. Second, which is people's right to autonomy. Now, Allen and Love, who are the writers of the Code of Ethics, in their reflection, they said that they used a narrow definition to describe autonomy in Code of Ethics because they followed the trend of other codes of other worlds, of other countries. And in doing this, considering only the narrow definition, they've missed out a very big chunk, which is competent people's right to make freely and voluntarily informed decisions pertaining to their lives. I guess this is something that I was missing. I think this is definitely connected to my current ethical dilemma. I would like Jade to make free and voluntarily informed decision about her life, which is continuation of my services. And so I think this is directly connected. So the next phase or the next stage would be for me to consider any non-rational factor like my values, which might trip me up in the future. So I would have to consider my family values, which is that I strongly believe families should stay together and that compromise is key in order to survive and stay together as a family, especially considering there's a child involved. And I self reflected after my sessions with Drew, and I realized that I was battling with it when I was working with him as well. I had to put in a lot of proactive strategies to ensure that even like consciously that my values did not deter me from delivering therapy. And so I'll have to be careful about it going into a therapeutic relationship with Jade. Next would be to consider rights and vulnerabilities of all the parties involved. And let's start with Jade. She has the right to informed consent and she has the right to autonomy. However, because of her diagnosis of chronic depression, this makes her a little vulnerable. The DSM 5 says that one of the symptoms of chronic depression is higher levels of negative affectivity or neuroticism. This means that the people who do have chronic depression have the most of them have the tendency to perceive information and events in their life in negative ways. Now, the risk factors include suicide. The risk factors also include the development of comorbid disorders like anxiety, psychosis. And what all of this information is telling me is that she is in dire need of therapy. She really needs it given her illness. And I think this particular need of therapy makes her vulnerable. Now, as a psychologist, I reserve the right to make an educated decision as her therapist. And I think I'm exercising that right while I'm following the model right now. What makes me vulnerable is that in Drew's sessions, I've had a therapeutic journey with Drew that started and ended. However, there was an element of empathy that may have developed in Drew's sessions, and consciously it won't. However, if if there were if I were to develop empathy with Jade, entering a therapeutic relationship with her, then the empathy that developed in Drew's sessions will come in conflict with Jade's. Consciously, I will work on it and I will make sure it doesn't, but subconsciously it could. And this particular conflict might make me vulnerable. So, according to all these information, there are two possible decisions that I can make. One is that I can tell Jade about Drew and inform her that Jade was my former client. And I will also allow her to choose whether she is comfortable enough to continue accessing my services or not. Second decision I can make is that I can withhold that information and continue delivering services. Consequences of option number one. Now, possibly, I would be preserving her respect. I would be preserving the principle of respect. I'd be preserving the respect to her autonomy. And if she were to choose to continue accessing my services, then we would have a strengthened rapport. We would have built trust in each other. We will have also minimized harm. Now, as Brock said in 1991 in his paper, that a physician and his patient should practice something called shared decision making. Allen and Love said this in their book as well. Shared decision making refers to the practice that a physician or a practitioner and their client have a transparent communication channel between them, and they come to a decision together. If I were to take option one, then I'd be practicing shared decision making, and this way Jade's right to autonomy is preserved. However, one very big consideration is that I will have broken Drew's confidentiality. And in the future, Drew could actually use that to raise a complaint against me. Possible consequences of option number two. Jade might make progress in her therapy considering she will have continued services. However, if she were to find out about all this information from Drew, she might feel cheated. She might feel that I've broken her trust. She might judge this behavior to be unacceptable, withdraw from therapy, and then be discouraged from joining it in the future. If that were to happen, then her illness will go untreated and it might worsen. All of this might even pose as a possible stressor, could trigger comorbid disorders, considering that she is at a high risk of developing comorbid disorders. And if all of this were to happen, then I'd be breaking the non-maleficence principle and I'd be breaching my personal professional responsibility. And at the end of this model, it seems pretty clear that one option has way more cons than the other. And so I will pick the one that has lesser cons, which is option number one. I will tell Jade and I will allow her to choose whether she would like to continue accessing my services or not. Now, these are my references. And since isolation is the enemy of careful deliberation, but consultation is its friend, I will turn to you for a consult and ask you, what are your thoughts?